So the space sector is undergoing a major transformation. About 50 years ago, the United States and the Soviet Union were the only two countries with any significant space programs. Much has changed since then. Today, more than 80 countries have space-based interests. Second, the commercial actors were an afterthought in the original space days. Today, they are coming into their own. In fact, in 2015, there was as much venture capital investment as the previous 15 years combined. So there's a lot of change afoot in the space sector. And the question is, what is the reality of this change? How do you separate reality from hype? What is the role of the US government, which spends in excess of $43 billion? To untangle all of these questions, NASA and the Office of the Director for National Intelligence asked my colleagues and I to look into this, and we wrote a report called Global Trends in Space. There's a bunch of things we learned in this study. The first is space isn't a monolith, even though we think of it as such. The sorts of things that you see in Earth observation or taking pictures of the Earth from space are very different from the sorts of things you see in space exploration. So we need to start thinking about space in slightly different ways. The second thing we learned was that there is a very interesting narrative underway. There is a magnitude narrative where the United States is the 800-pound gorilla. We spend more money on space than all of the other countries in the world combined. But there's a more interesting directional narrative. Where is the world going? And that's where things start to get really exciting. And that's what we focused on. So what did we learn in that directional narrative? We learned that there's this very interesting bifurcation going on in the space sector. There is a very government-controlled, government-run sector with big, what we call big space, exploration of Pluto or a manned trip to the moon. They will always stay within the government sector. But there is a new and a very interesting emerging consumer-driven space sector, which is not performance-oriented. It's cost-conscious, and it focuses on things that citizens care about. Things like you could now task a satellite to take pictures for you for hundreds of dollars, not millions like it used to be, and within minutes of making the request, not months or years. That's a huge game changer. And it isn't just consumers who are taking advantage of this change, it's other countries. For example, the Ministry of Communication in Turkmenistan, with very little space infrastructure, was able to contract with Thales Alenia, which is a French-Italian multinational, to build a satellite for it, SpaceX, which is an American launch provider, to launch it, and a Monaco-based operator to operate it with hardly any infrastructure of its own. And they become space players. And that is very important for us to understand as we see our place in the global space domain. I think the first thing we need to do is to decide if these trends are real and if they want to accept them and acknowledge them as such. We don't have to. We can decide that we want to actively fight them. For example, starve the emerging commercial sector, or drift and address these sorts of issues on a one-off basis. Assuming that the first one is the correct option going forward, the government has three things it can be doing. First, to better leverage developments in the private sector, whether it's launch capabilities or capabilities to conduct space situation awareness or even exploration. Second, bring the rest of the world in the space fold. Again, whether it's related to Earth observation or space situation awareness or other sorts of things where there is growing capabilities around the world. The third one is that the United States needs to take a leadership role. As participation in space increases, there are challenges that we see. An example being orbital debris. The US should be taking a lead on how some of these global challenges need to be addressed. All of these can be done if we decide that the government agencies are not the front runners with the rest of the world as followers. The government needs to think of itself as the catalyst that will be seeding innovation both within the government and outside. if we can make that subtle but important shift, we can make a lot of progress in this community. And this is a change we have seen in other sectors as they have become more globalized and international, computing being an example. It used to be that the integrated circuit, for example, was developed in the military. Today, the military is a happy consumer of ICs from the private sector. The space community needs to be able to make a similar change. Luckily, we have a lot of bright, far-thinking folks in our government, and I believe that these changes are very feasible.